welcome back to our next video for period 5, the failure of compromise. This is one of the most essential lessons in APUS history, especially in period 5. It deals with the events leading up to the Civil War, and it is chock full of important vocabulary terms. So buckle up and let's dive in. So your main goal is to explain the political causes of the Civil War. And we are looking at things like the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Dred Scott Decision. We are looking at the end of the second party system and the development of the Republican Party in the North. So we're going to do a little historical context. We're going to look at 5 specific events, and then we're going to discuss the end of the second party system. So just as a reminder, leading up to the 1850s, we have the issue of slavery being a major area of conflict in American politics. So we see sectional tensions continuing to increase. However, in 1820, those tensions were temporarily resolved with the Missouri Compromise. So in the Missouri Compromise, it was determined that all that land in the orange, the northern lands, would not be allowed to have slavery. And then areas in the green, slavery would be permitted. What changes that is the war with Mexico. So with the war with Mexico, the U.S. gained all this western land. And so the Compromise of 1850 developed to determine what to do with that land. And for the first time, they allowed for popular sovereignty to be used with the Utah, New Mexico territories, which means that the decision about slavery would be left to the people living in those territories. So now moving forward, we have high tensions after the Compromise of 1850 with the Fugitive Slave Act, with growing anti-slavery and abolitionists, with things like with Uncle Tom's Cabin being published. And so in the election of 1852, we see trouble developing for the Whig Party. The Whig Party has both pro-slavery and anti-slavery people who support the party. And so really what happens is in 1852, they are divided over who to support. And so Franklin Pierce, a Democrat, wins in the 1852 election. So then comes the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So this is going to be proposed by Stephen Douglas from Illinois. This kind of brings him into more of a national spotlight. And the proposal is that this large territory would be divided into Kansas and Nebraska, and that popular sovereignty would be used to determine whether they would be free or slave. And this would ignore the Missouri Compromise because according to the Missouri Compromise, both of these territories, slavery would be prohibited in them. And so this would ignore that Missouri Compromise. And so it brings those tensions back up in Congress. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act is in fact passed. And so now you see what has happened when you look from the Missouri Compromise to the Compromise of 1850 and now to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. You see a huge amount of territory that is now opened to slavery. And so this is, of course, going to increase tension significantly, not only in Congress, but throughout the country. So what happens after this act is passed is something that's called bleeding Kansas. So once people are aware that the people living in the territory are going to get to choose, there are settlers that flood to Kansas to impact the election. In fact, a group called the New England Immigrant Aid Company helped pay for people to move to Kansas in order to vote for it to be a free territory. Missourians who cross the border are known as border ruffians. And so there is absolutely profuse voter fraud. And according to this, in one location, only 20 out of 600 votes were from legal residents. So with the voter fraud happening, pro-slavery forces won the election. So this leads to massive violence, like I mentioned, bleeding Kansas. So one government is created as a pro-slavery, one is as a free government, and we see settlers on both sides attacking each other. Most famously is going to be John Brown. John Brown and his sons are going to murder 5 pro-slavery settlers. We see the proposal from the pro-slavery government to be admitted into the government as a pro-slavery state, and that will be rejected. And so we essentially have two governments running Kansas until 1861, and that's why this is sometimes known as a civil war. Here is a pretty popular image demonstrating the Bleeding Kansas that took place. All right, next up in our increasing tensions, we move on to 1856 with the caning of Charles Sumner. So this violence is going to not just happen in Kansas, it spills into Congress. So Charles Sumner is an abolitionist from Massachusetts, and he gives this famous speech called The Crime Against Kansas. And what he does is he uses explicit language, including the term rape, the raping of the South, to call out the barbaric nature of slavery. And so he basically describes how plantation owners, how slave owners understand that the more slaves they have, it means the more wealth they will have. And so he is calling them out on that connection. And he specifically addresses Andrew Butler, a senator from South Carolina, who was known for having children from enslaved women. Now, Butler's neighbor and relative, Preston Brooks, is going to defend the honor of his uncle by basically caning Sumner to death. He is going to end up with a brain injury for the rest of his life. When this story ends up in the public, it is so impactful that Northerners will vomit or be too depressed to even go to work. The Southerners, however, treat Brooks as a hero. There are statues in his honor in the South, and they sent maybe just one statue, and they sent him thousands of canes and trophies as to kind of celebrate his heroicism. And here is the image most commonly associated with the caning of Charles Sumner. Okay, next up, extremely impactful is going to be the Dred Scott versus Sanford case. And this has been known as the most egregious or worst decision by the Supreme Court. So the crisis worsened with this Supreme Court decision. So what happens is there's this man, Dred Scott, who was born enslaved in Virginia, but he was held enslaved in Missouri. He moves temporarily into free territory, and then his owner dies and leaves possessions to his wife. And they end up going back to the South during this time. So Scott is going to sue Mr. Emerson, saying that he was free when he moved into the free territory. Now, there were cases similar to this that had happened in Europe, other cases in the United States. And so there were some precedents that were in conflict with each other. And so that's why this case ended up reaching the Supreme Court. So what happens is Chief Justice Roger Taney ruled, with a majority of the court, ruled that Scott could not be a citizen and therefore did not have the right to sue at all. And the reasons for this decision was that the court decided when the Constitution was written, the framers did not intend for African Americans to be citizens, and only citizens had the right to sue. But then they took the decision a step further and said the Missouri Compromise deprived white people of their right to property, and therefore it was unconstitutional. So while we know that the Kansas-Nebraska Act ignored the Missouri Compromise, now the Dred Scott decision actually repeals the Missouri Compromise and allows for slavery to exist in all of those territories. Here's the actual decision. We think that they, people of African ancestry, are not included and were not intended to be included under the word citizens in the Constitution, and can therefore claim none of the rights and privileges that instrument provides for and secures to citizens of the United States. So the result, Scott does return to slavery, but by this point, Mrs. Emerson had remarried to an abolitionist. So they did not grant the Scotts their freedom, but instead sold them to another family who granted them their freedom. And unfortunately, Scott died of tuberculosis just a year later. So this decision infuriated Northern Republicans. I already mentioned it repealed the Missouri Compromise, and it increased fears of a slave power conspiracy. And so what Northerners begin to believe is that there are certain individuals in government that are conspiring to increase the power of slave owners and the South. All right, next up. is our Lincoln-Douglas debates. And so we already mentioned Stephen Douglas earlier in this lesson. He was the one who proposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So there's an Illinois Senate race that garnered a huge amount of national attention between Douglas and Abraham Lincoln. And there was a series of debates that really brought Lincoln into the national spotlight. Most importantly was his speech called A House Divided. And here's a tiny excerpt. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect that it will cease to be divided. And so even though Lincoln ends up being just a free soiler, someone who doesn't want slavery to expand to the West, people read into this and say, oh, he must be wanting the entire United States to either be pro-slavery or anti-slavery. And clearly, as a free soiler, he would want slavery to be abolished. So Douglas does win the Senate seat, but this national attention that Lincoln gained really allowed for him to be successful just 2 years later in the 1860 presidential election. All right, our last major event that we're going to discuss here leading up to the Civil War is going to be John Brown's raid. So if you remember, John Brown was one of those anti-slavery advocates in Kansas who murdered pro-slavery neighbors. So he is an abolitionist. He believes violence is necessary and acceptable. And additionally, he believed he was chosen by God. So if you remember Nat Turner from period 4, Nat Turner believed all of these same things. And he also was not depicted as a hero, but was depicted as being insane. And that same claim of insanity is going to be used to describe John Brown. John Brown is friends with Frederick Douglass, and here is an important quote. Although John Brown is white, his heart is so steeled against slavery that he is, in effect, a black man. So, a little bit of a controversial statement here, but I think you can tell, just based on the content here, how remarkable John Brown was and how respected he was by some of our other important leaders like Frederick Douglass. So what John Brown does is he leads an attack on a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. What he wanted to do was to gather the weapons there, alert enslaved persons in the area to come get weapons, and then to start a massive slave uprising. Now, the U.S. Marines come and put down the attack on the arsenal, and they kill some of the rebels, but they imprison Brown, and they end up hanging him for treason. This event was so impactful, some historians have called it the 9/11 of the 19th century. It was front page news for over 6 months. He was referred to mostly by Southerners as a madman, a villain, a criminal, but in the North, he was more referred to as a martyr for the cause of slavery. And so Douglas, again, has a quote about John Brown. He says, John Brown is not insane. It is an appalling fact in the history of the American people that they have so far forgotten their own heroic age as readily to accept the charge of insanity against a man who has imitated the heroes of Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill. So Douglas here is saying that John Brown is acting just like our Revolutionary War heroes, and yet we are calling him insane. So again, here is a typical image for you depicting John Brown as an insane person. But this one here is a more likely painting of what was happening. So here you see him looking very fatherly or very kind here in relation to the African-American baby that he is hugging or kissing. Okay, our last concept here is going to be the end of the second party system. So the second party system is a term used to describe from 1828 to 1854, and where we see a huge rise in American activism. What was happening here was the election with Andrew Jackson, which he called the corrupt bargain. And so he lost that election to John Quincy Adams despite gaining the popular vote or winning the popular vote. And so he works with people to create a new Democratic Party, which removed the property requirement for voting, which more than tripled the amount of voters from 1828 to 1832. And so what happens after that is a huge increase in American participation in government. And so we see two distinct political parties during that time, the Democrats and the Whigs. But as we mentioned earlier in this lesson, the 1852 election demonstrated a weakening point for the Whigs. And so we see new parties emerging, which we call the third party system, where we have multiple minor parties that are vying for national attention. So the Free Soil Party opposed the expansion of slavery. The Know Nothing Party, which did exist earlier, but when it became the American Party, it actually was slightly more successful. And they are a nativist anti-Catholic party. The Constitutional Union Party, which are Southern Whigs, but who are opposed to secession. But then most importantly is we have the Republican Party. So this is going to be a coalition of a wide group of anti-slavery and abolitionists. They are in agreement about opposing the expansion of slavery. They are not in agreement about abolition. But they do, one of their main planks of their platform is they want to repeal the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So in 1856, we see the Republican candidate John C. Fremont doing very well for this being the first presidential election just 2 years after the founding of the Republican Party. We see him uniting a huge swath of Americans in the Republican Party. And this, of course, leads up to our next lesson, which is the election of 1866 and the secession of the South. So I hope that this, although it was a lengthy lesson, I hope that you are able to explain the political causes of the Civil War. And if so, please like and subscribe. Thank you.